If you're a fan of American soap operas, you might recognize the name and face of a survivor of the worst maritime sinking in world history. His given name is Hans-Jörg Gudegast, but he became Eric Braeden when he became an actor in Hollywood in the 1960s. Braeden has starred or co-starred in many TV shows and movies, winning a Daytime Emmy in 1998 and playing the role of Tycoon John Jacob Astor IV in the mega-hit Titanic. Braeden's early brush with death at sea was a secret even while filming the movie. Sometime after the release of Titanic, he revealed that when he was almost 4 years old, he and his parents were passengers of the German cruise liner MV Wilhelm Gustloff when it was sunk by a Soviet submarine on January 30th, 1945. Braeden's father had been mayor of the small town of Bredenbeck, from which Braeden would later take part of his new American name. Braeden and his family survived, 3 of the 1,000 that survived the sinking. Over 9,000 other people were not so fortunate. More people by far died aboard the Gustloff than did aboard the Titanic and its famous sister ship, the Lusitania, when it was sunk by a German submarine in World War I. Far more. The ship's namesake was a German-born Swiss, and a nasty piece of work who led a small Nazi party in Switzerland. He and others agitated, pressed, threatened, spoke, and politicked for Hitler in the small mountain country, hoping to take over Switzerland from within. In 1936, Gustloff was shot and killed by David Frankfurter, a young Jewish man from Yugoslavia who had begun his college education in Germany in 1931. Frankfurter witnessed the rise of the Nazis to power and saw the hateful changes that had come over Germany in a short time. In 1934, Frankfurter moved to Switzerland to continue his education. In Switzerland, he worked to ensure that the Swiss, especially the Jews of Switzerland, knew what life under the Nazis was like. In 1936, seeing Nazis in the streets in small but growing numbers, Frankfurter went to Gustloff's house and killed him with a gun he had bought shortly before. Frankfurter was given a life sentence and spent the war in a Swiss prison, but was pardoned just before the end of the war and lived until 1982. At his funeral in Germany, Hitler promised Gustloff's widow that her husband would be remembered with a notable honor. A year later, a new cruise ship, which was supposed to be named after the Führer, was named after Gustloff. From 1937 to 1939 and the outbreak of World War II, the Gustloff was the flagship of the Kraft durch Freude, or Strength Through Joy ships, one of the few nice things the Nazis did. The KDF or KDF was an organization designed to bring Germans together in recreational activities and low-cost vacations for those who could not afford it. However, high-ranking Nazis and their friends who could afford it went on the cheap too. The KDF ships took primarily working Germans to the tropical Azores, Canaries, and Madeira Islands, among other places in warmer European climes, and were quite popular. Tens of thousands of people had taken pleasure cruises aboard the Gustloff when World War II began. For over a year, the Gustloff served as a hospital ship, but fears of the more numerous Allied surface fleet and Allied submarines caused her to be docked in the port of Gdynia, Poland, known to the Nazis as Gortenhafen. There, the ship acted as a barracks for submarine crews undergoing training. By January 30th, 1945, Germany was in full retreat, and Soviet troops had already entered the easternmost German state, East Prussia, passing south of Gdynia. Along the Polish and northeastern German coast, the Nazis held the Soviets back, but were in danger of being cut off against the Baltic Sea if they didn't retreat quickly. Gdynia was full of people from all over northern and central Europe, some who had fled their own countries ahead of the Red Army, as well as many who were prisoners of war. Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, as well as people from the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, whose countries had been taken over by the Soviets before the war and whose fear of the Red Army made them decide in favor of Germany. Already, stories of Red Army atrocities in East Prussian cities had spread throughout Germany, and people fled in near panic before the approaching Soviets. Gdynia was filled with people trying to find a way out of what was fast becoming a trap. Any German trains that were still running were reserved for troops and party officials. Any remaining civilian cars had been impounded by the military, as had virtually all horses. There were only two ways out of Gdynia: on foot or by ship, and walking was never going to be faster than the Russian advance. The Gustloff was designed to carry 1,900 people, including 400 crew. When the Gustloff left Gdynia, some 10,000 people were aboard. Even without risk of Soviet attack, the voyage of the Gustloff back to Germany would have been dangerous. At the wharf, the sailors and military police had begun taking tickets, which had been given by the German authorities to those they deemed important, were German citizens, or who had written permission. As you might imagine, the combination of rumors of what the Red Army was doing to German and many other civilians, especially women and girls, began to spur a panic. Combined with the sounds of distant combat, things got out of control. Soon, the sailors and guards taking tickets rushed for the ship themselves, and virtually every inch of the ship, including the decks, was full of refugees. Just after 12 on the afternoon of January 30th, 1945, the Gustloff weighed anchor and made her way out of Gdynia port towards Germany. The ship was supposed to be part of a small convoy, with 3 Navy torpedo boats protecting her, but due to mechanical difficulties, 2 of them had to return to port. The Gustloff's only escort was the torpedo boat Löwe, or Lion. The Gustloff's captain made a couple of risky decisions. First, that he would only travel at a maximum of 12 knots, despite the Submarine Training Division commander's emphatic request that they travel at least 15 knots, as Soviet submarines would not be able to keep up, reducing the chances of being torpedoed. Second, he rejected a plea that he hug the coastline, arguing that he was unfamiliar with the waters and which he knew were mined, and that he felt safer further out to sea in areas that had been cleared of mines. Third, at 6 p.m. after dark in the cold and cloudy winter of the Baltic Sea, Captain Friedrich Petersen received information that a flotilla of German minesweepers were heading his direction, and he ordered the red and green navigation lights of the Gustloff turned on so the minesweepers might see his ship. 1 hour later, the commander of Soviet submarine S-13 Alexander Marinesko, who was not popular among the Soviet naval hierarchy because he had been reported drunk on duty once too often, pumped 3 torpedoes into the Gustloff and hoped that in sinking her, his career would be revived. The torpedoes all struck on the Gustloff's port side. One hit the bow and triggered the locking of the watertight doors, which sealed the fate of those in the front part of the ship by sealing them in. The second torpedo struck closer to the center of the ship, and what happened there is beyond ghastly. The Gustloff had a pool aboard her, which was empty of water in 1945, but full of German nurses who were massed inside it. When the Soviet torpedo hit, it sent a shockwave hurtling through the ship. When the shockwave hit the pool, it broke loose the thousands of tiles lining the pool, turning them into ceramic shrapnel. Hundreds of nurses were torn apart instantly. Only 3 survived the tragedy. The third Soviet torpedo also struck amidships, though a bit further to the rear and below, hitting the ship's engine room, disabling all power and communication on the ship. A perfect hit. Many deaths were caused in the initial explosions, but many more were to come. The ship had only 9 lifeboats, and most of those were frozen to the davits from which they hung. The Baltic Sea in January is freezing cold. Some of the people on deck were able to break lifeboats from the ice and lower them into the water, but those were very few. They then went through the horror we're familiar with from the movie Titanic. They had to beat other survivors off the sides of the boat as they attempted to get out of the freezing water. Then they had to see and listen to the ship going down. Most of the deaths in the Gustloff disaster occurred in the initial explosions, or being trapped within the ship by the in-rushing water. Stampedes on the stairs or on deck caused the trampling deaths of many others. Still, hundreds if not thousands of people managed to jump free of the ship, especially after she listed severely to her port side, which caused some of the freed lifeboats to break free before they were lowered into the sea, sliding across the deck, crushing and pushing people into the water on the opposite side, and spilling their passengers onto the deck and over the side. 40 minutes after it had been struck by the S-13's torpedoes, the Wilhelm Gustloff sank beneath the waves in 144 feet of water. 1,272 people were rescued by German naval forces, including the Louvre, another torpedo boat she summoned, and the approaching minesweepers. In addition to Captain Petersen, 3 other German naval captains survived the disaster. None went down with the ship. Only one, and it was not Petersen, was subject to an investigation. But by the time the war ended 2.5 months later, the investigation had barely gotten underway. Soviet submarine commander Marinesko was the highest-scoring Soviet submarine commander of the war, including the Gustloff, which he believed held German military personnel, but he was demoted for his drunken behavior afterwards and died in anonymity in 1963. In 1990, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev named him a hero of the Soviet Union. Why is the sinking of the Gustloff, the greatest single-event tragedy at sea in history, not more well known? The answer is simple: Nazis. By the time the Gustloff met its tragic end, the world had been through more than 5 years of war in Europe. Nazi occupation had brought hunger, oppression, fear, torture, and death to millions in Europe. What's more, the world was beginning to see firsthand the result of the Nazis' attempt to eliminate those they deemed inferior. 3 days before the Gustloff was sunk, the Red Army had liberated Auschwitz. And by the time reports of the Gustloff sinking, there was a sentiment that the Nazis deserve everything they get. For the victims of the Gustloff, that was being forgotten, and for the survivors, a hidden trauma that many, like Eric Braden, kept for decades. When the survivors of the USS Indianapolis were found, and their stories began to filter through the Navy, the government, and the press, there was a fascination with what had happened and a stoic and sober respect for the men of the ship, both those who died in the tragedy and those who survived. For a time after the war, the Indianapolis was in the headlines, as its captain faced charges of dereliction of duty in his actions, before the heavy cruiser was sent to the bottom by a Japanese submarine in the war's final days. Then, when Indianapolis's last captain, Charles McVeigh, took his own life in 1968 after years of torment from within and without, the ship's tragedy again became front-page news. And then it faded from view again, only to become a part of one of the most iconic and popular movies of the 20th century, Jaws.
So, but that's the USS Indianapolis.
Jaws was a horror movie, and horror movies aim to frighten and thrill the audience. Facts aren't the biggest factor. Unfortunately, one thing the movie got wrong was the famous scene of the shark fisherman Quint telling his story of being a crewman on the Indianapolis on the fateful night it went down. He alludes to the number of men on the ship as 1,190, which is basically correct. There were 1,195, and he tells the other characters in the scene that 890 men went in the water. 316 came out, sharks got the rest. But though the sinking of the Indianapolis resulted in the single largest loss of life to sharks in recorded history, 574 men weren't killed by sharks. 150 were though, and that number alone is enough to terrify anyone who thinks about what that means. Some men who floated in the sea died of injury shortly after getting in the water. Many died of thirst. Some men, gone mad by the situation and the lack of fresh water, began to drink seawater, which can result in hallucinations, delusions, and death. A number of these men dove under the water and convinced themselves in their madness that a stream of fresh water was running just below the surface and tried to talk their shipmates into going down with them. These men died below the waves. Imagine the madness that had to be fought off to deal with slowly dying of thirst, surrounded by water you couldn't drink. Some of the notions that sharks took all of the Indianapolis's crew that died at sea originates in the fact that most of the bodies of those who died were torn apart and eaten by the sharks. A man whose eyes are swollen from salt, suffering from near mental and physical exhaustion, who sees a body being eaten, is going to likely assume that his crewmate was killed by the predators. In this case, primarily oceanic white-tip sharks, whose average length is about 7 feet, though 9 is not unheard of. The largest white-tip ever caught was 13 feet long. Of course, there were some smaller blue sharks, the larger, more solitary tiger sharks, and perhaps others. Whether over 500 men were killed by the sharks or only 150 doesn't change the fact that the men of the USS Indianapolis endured the worst single shark attack on record. The surviving crew and their captain were in the water after the Japanese sub I-58 slammed 2 torpedoes into the Indy on July 15, 1945, just past midnight. No one in US Naval Command knew where the Indianapolis was. She was indeed part of the effort to take the Hiroshima atomic bomb to Tinian Island, and her mission was the topmost of top secret. Some people make the mistake of saying she carried the entire bomb. Still, the ship carried only parts for the bomb, crucial components to be sure, but not the whole thing. That was too valuable to put in just one place before the weapon was deployed. The Indianapolis had delivered the top secret components. No one aboard knew what was in the large box that had been wheeled into the hold, not even the Marines who were ordered to guard it with their lives, 24 hours a day for the 10 days it took her to get to Tinian from San Francisco. The ship was also ordered to be radio silent, which is one reason no one was sure where it was and wasn't even reported missing for days. After the Japanese torpedoes hit it, the ship went down in 12 minutes, and no distress signal went out. It was only by chance that a US Navy Ventura bomber and scout plane passed overhead almost 4 days later and spotted a long, scattered group of survivors in the water. A rescue call went out, and the first on the scene was a PBY float plane. PBYs were not supposed to land on the open ocean, but luckily, despite heavy swells, the plane's crew elected to land and begin rescuing survivors. They even lashed nearly 60 men to the wings with parachute cord, making the plane unflyable but saving the men hours more in the ocean before US Navy ships began to arrive. There was plenty of blame to go around for the sinking and delayed rescue of the Indy's crew. Virtually none of it rested on the shoulders of Captain McVeigh, who many surviving crewmen credited with keeping them alive. But the Navy, whose high command had just assumed Indianapolis had made it to port in the Philippines, needed a scapegoat, and that was Captain McVeigh, who among other things had asked for an escort of sub-hunting destroyers but was turned down because high command felt the threat was negligible and didn't want to attract attention to the top secret mission. At his hearing, the Navy focused on one thing, that McVeigh hadn't ordered the ship to zigzag, the standard maneuver in evading submarines or making it a more difficult target. The captain of the Japanese submarine was brought in for questioning, and he said that it would not have mattered if the Indianapolis had zigzagged or not. He was lined up for the perfect shot. In the end, McVeigh's bravery in the water saved him from more severe consequences at his court-martial, but his career in the Navy, which he had been in since 1920, was effectively over. He was allowed to retire in 1949 with the rank of Rear Admiral. Still, in naval circles and nationally, the hearings had made McVeigh a national disgrace, despite the facts of the case and the testimony of not only his crew, but his enemy. For years, he was haunted with guilt, made worse by occasional letters from the relatives of deceased crew members who told him they wished him dead. Finally, in 1968, he shot and killed himself. In 2000, President Clinton and Congress officially exonerated him. The survivors of the Indianapolis endured unimaginable horror, but...
Anyway, we delivered the